So 4,000 years ago, from the ancient world, God chose one man, and he chose this man to form a special relationship with him. He was going to do something that God had never done before. And this man's name is Abraham. And the new thing he was going to do is he was going to create a nation from this one man, from his family. And this nation would then also have a special relationship with God. A race of people who worship God and more or less continuously throughout their history would have God as their one true God. Something God knew no other nation or people in history would do, at least over the long term. So let's read about God choosing this man Abraham in Genesis chapter 12. So we know nothing about Abraham before Genesis chapter 12, apart from that he lived in a city that didn't really care or worship out God, and we know from the New Testament that he was an idol worshipper, so wasn't always a worshipper of God, but God chose him. He chose him we'll start in verse 1. Now Yahweh had said unto Abram, another previous name, Abram was the first name, Abraham was what it was changed to later. Get thee out of thy country and from thy kindred and from thy father's house unto a land that I will show thee. And I'll make of thee a great nation, and I'll bless thee and make thy name great, and thou shalt be a blessing. And I'll bless them that bless thee, and curse him that curseth thee, and in thee all families of the earth shall be blessed. So these three verses, they actually tell us quite a bit. So Abraham is living in Mesopotamia, in a city called modern-day Iraq. And one day, God appears to him, as I said, seemingly out of the blue, and he asks him to pack up his whole life, his whole family's life, and to leave and to travel to an unknown destination. It wasn't yet revealed. A land that he would be guided to by God. And of course, we learn later in the story that that land is the land of Canaan, which became known as the land of Israel. So God says in these verses that he's going to make a nation of him, and he's going to have quite a large family. A great nation will come from him. And also that the happiness and success, or otherwise, of other individuals and other nations around this group of people, well, that would depend on their relationship to Abraham, and also, we take by extension, to his family. So people who bless Abraham and bless his family, well, they'll be blessed. And people who curse Abraham and curse his family, well, we read that they would be cursed. And so from the rest of the chapters in the Bible, we know that this group of people, this nation, this great nation that he's talking about particularly, would be the nation of Israel. Israel being another name for the grandson of Abraham, whose name was originally Jacob. God likes to mix people's names around because the names have important meanings in the original language. And another name that the people of Israel are given, of course, is the name of the children of Jacob. The race is the Jewish people, which is our topic tonight, the existence of the Jews. So the Jewish people, the idea of the Jew comes from the grandson of Abraham, who was called Judah, who was a big influence on the history of this nation. Judah, the man, Jewish people, because he had an influence over them. So let's read a little bit more about this relationship God is developing with Abraham and his family in Genesis chapter 17. All right, he's making a covenant with Abraham in this chapter. Some special, important and relevant promises start in verse 7. And I will establish my covenant between me and thee, Abraham, and thy seed, the children of Israel, after thee, in their generations, for an everlasting covenant, to be a God unto thee, and to thy seed after thee. And I will give unto thee and to thy seed after thee the land wherein thou art a stranger, all the land of Canaan, for an everlasting possession, and I will be their God. So in this verse, Abraham has already travelled. In chapter 12, he hadn't moved anywhere yet. So in chapter 17, he'd made the journey, trusted God, and he'd taken him all the way from Mesopotamia to modern-day Israel, or back then the land of Canaan. And God reveals to him that this, as he's speaking to him right now, the land in which he's standing would be the land he would be given, the promised land, if you will. A land that God is clear to explain to him is not his right now, at the time of the conversation. He was a stranger, it specifically says, in this land, in verse 8. But it would definitely be given to him and his family, for an everlasting possession. His family would have it forever. Okay, important to note when we go and talk about the history of the people of Israel. They would have it forever, but interestingly, for periods of time, they would actually lose it, depending on their own relationship with God, which God was trying to develop. As he says here in verse 8, he wants to be their God. That was the point of choosing this group of people, not because he wanted to show favouritism, but because he wanted to build a relationship with these people. So God's plans, well, the plans that God has, are not always simple. The simple reading of what would happen, the future of what would happen in Genesis chapter 17, we certainly wouldn't guess what actually does happen in the story. So it wasn't, in fact, till 400 years later, approximately, after he's promised he would get the land, that his family inherit the former land of Canaan. So in fact, Abraham and his family, well, they spend 200 years in the land of Egypt, the last 200 years of those 400, in which they're actually slaves. All right? They're stateless and persecuted people almost the whole time from that promise. So the idea that we will need to explore is, why would God do this to his people? What's the point of not giving his promises as soon as he offers them? And the answer to that question should give us some confidence that the God of this people is actually the true God. You don't write stories like this if you don't have some deeper meaning and a plan that you're developing right the way through history. So we'll get that to that later, but let's have a look and follow the journey from Egypt that we mentioned they were taken as slaves to, and coming out of Egypt in Exodus chapter 19. So this is the history of the Jewish people, not a simple history. Evidence that there is a God guiding the history of these people, as he says there is. So in Exodus chapter 19, verse 1, in the 3rd month, when the children of Israel were gone forth out of the land of Egypt, they came the same day into the wilderness of Sinai. So there you go. God had brought Israel out of Egypt. Been there for 360 roughly, 215 years in Egypt, and now it was time for them to move out. So God's rescued them from a pretty hard life, a difficult life of being slaves, and he's brought them into a wilderness. Verse 3. And Moses went up unto God, and Yahweh called unto him out of the mountain, saying, Thus shall you say unto the house of Jacob, and tell the children of Israel, Ye have seen what I did to the Egyptians, and how I bare you on eagle's wings, and brought you unto myself. Now therefore, if you will obey my voice indeed and keep my covenant, then you shall be a peculiar treasure unto me above all people, for all the earth is mine. And ye shall be unto me a kingdom of priests and an holy nation. And these are the words which thou shalt speak unto the children of Israel. So God says, I've saved these people. I've decimated the Egyptians with 10 horrible plagues, fulfilling the promise, wasn't it, that those who cursed Abraham and his family would themselves be cursed. So God brings them from Egypt into Israel, and it's as if, in the analogy in verse 4, that they're carried by an eagle, soaring high above all the problems that would have faced them, because God was with them. And he brought them, not to Sinai, which is where he actually brought them, but he was bringing them to himself. He was bringing them there to start a relationship. He didn't, as he could have, take them to their own land. He didn't say, well, here you go, as I promised you, now we'll give you the land. But he took them to a wilderness, a place with no distractions, to focus on their relationship with God and with each other, of course, as they start to build this nation who would do amazing things, become a kingdom of priests, a pretty high calling. So God wanted to bring them to this place, and he wanted to talk to them, to communicate with them. All right, because these people were going to be very special. He says in verse 5, I'll keep my covenant, and then ye shall be to me a peculiar treasure above all people, for all the earth is mine. And then we read, he wants them to be a kingdom of priests and a holy nation. Okay, so this is consistent, isn't it, with what we've seen so far about God's special interest in this family of Abraham, the children of Israel. They'll be a kingdom of priests. And a priest is someone who brings someone else to God. They're someone in the middle. They're about building and developing relationships. So the idea is that the people of Israel, these Jewish people, are to bring other nations to come to God, their God, and they are his special people. But all the earth is his. He's not just interested in one particular nation. So Israel were to be a holy, a separate, a special nation, a group of people. So in the story that we read throughout the book of Exodus and the chapters afterward, it is an incredible story. It turns out it wouldn't be another 40 years later before they would finally be given the land that Abraham was originally promised some 400 years earlier. And Bible skeptics, who usually won't believe in a God at all, will say, well, that's a great story, but it's probably, no, it is just a story that some Jews have made up. Because the Jews, in their opinion, are just another bunch of Arabs who got together and created a new fantastic religion with some great stories, a whole heap of rules, and then they wrote their holy books. And there you are, a new religion with a false history to back it up, to make them seem like they're special. To make them seem like they're the only people that God really loves. And the Bible skeptics certainly would believe that God plays absolutely no part in the Jewish history, and in fact the things that are written in the Bible are no proof at all that God is real. And that's what we want to examine today. Do these stories help us get to the place that we believe as Christians that God is real? Or could it still be open that the whole thing is just a cleverly concocted story? Well, if they were going to make it up, let's have a look at what they actually do make up, because the story is pretty fantastic. The English expression is, when something is so amazing, you go, wow, you can't even make that stuff up. And that's like what we read in these stories. So, God wanted to turn them into a nation of priests. He has up to 2 million people in the wilderness who he's talking to say, hey, you don't really know me because I haven't been talking to you guys for a while. but hey, I'm your God. And now we're going to start again with a brand new nation. And I want you all to be priests. But it doesn't happen. And it doesn't happen because God gives people a choice. And he records those choices, the good and the bad, in the pages of history about the Jewish people. If the Jewish people wrote it, you'd think that mostly they might want to make themselves look pretty good, right? Because this book was written over a long period of time. If it was all written and made up by the Jews, you'd think they'd put all the good bits in and leave the bad. But we take the story as we read it, warts and all, as it refers to the Jewish position. So, God has brought them out of Egypt. In God's words, on eagle's wings. All right, they were soaring out of there, protected and looked after the whole way by the only true and living God. And he says, he's told them, he's promised them, I'm taking you guys to the land of Canaan. That's where we're going because that was the promise that I gave 400 years ago. Do you believe it? Well, it's not that hard to believe because I've taken you out of Egypt. We're halfway already, so let's go. But it didn't really work out like that, did it? So if we know the story and we don't have time to look at all the detail, it just so happened that this land, the new land of Canaan, was no pushover land that you could just walk into with hay bale fences. Right? They were strong, fortified cities. They were organised. They had mighty armies. And some of the individuals in these armies were actually giants who could take on 10 men to their 1 to their 10. So let's read about the lack of belief in God in Deuteronomy chapter 1, that these people God's trying to develop a relationship with show. All right, and I believe this gives us more proof that God is real. So Deuteronomy chapter 1, and we'll read from verse 27. And ye murmured, talking of the children of Israel, in your tents, because Yahweh hated us, because he has brought us forth out of the land of Egypt to deliver us unto the hand of the Amorites, the people who lived in the land of Canaan, to destroy us. Whither shall we go up? Our brethren have discouraged our hearts, saying, the people is greater and taller than we. The cities are great and walled up to heaven. And moreover, we have seen the sons of the Anakims there, the giants. Then I said unto you, Moses speaking, dread not, neither be afraid of them. Yahweh your God, which goeth before you, he shall fight for you, according to all that he did for you in Egypt, before your eyes. It should be clear, it should be obvious. And in the wilderness, where thou hast seen how that Yahweh thy God bare thee, as a man doth bear his son, in all the way that he went unto the place, until you come to this place. Yet in this thing ye did not believe Yahweh your God, who went in the way before you to search out a place to pitch your tents, in a fire by night, to show you by what way you should go, and in a cloud by day. And Yahweh heard the words of your voice, and was wroth, and sware, saying, surely there shall not one of these men of this evil generation that see that good land which I swear to give unto your fathers, save Caleb the son of Jephunneh, he shall see it. And to him I will give the land that he hath trodden, because unto his children he has wholly followed Yahweh. All right, so it's an amazing story. All right, God is working with this special group of people who are supposed to be his people, and none of them are, except 2 in a whole generation. He's wasted his time bringing these people to this wilderness because only 2 will accept his offer to be his peculiar treasure, to be the priests that he wanted them to be. All right, so the story is a true history, and we know that the Jews survived. Their children did go into the promised land, and they created the state of Israel, but it's not always simple along the way, right? And God works in his own way, and in this whole process, he's teaching us so many lessons about how he wants us to live and how he wants us to respond to him. So, today, we can read the story. Today we can read extra-biblical history, and ancient extra-biblical history, which gives us evidence right throughout the history of Israel that these people were here in the land and things are corroborating. We can have a look at the archaeological evidence. So we can fly to Israel today, and there is a state of Israel, a place called Israel, and it's the same place that the ancient Israelites lived in. And we can see that this archaeology is corroborating and showing exactly the stories that we read in the Bible, they're real. And as far as I'm aware, there's been no archaeological discoveries at all which contradict the facts as they're laid out in the Bible. So proof relating to the Jews that the record at least is true, and the record of course includes a very real and interactive God who we also would believe to be true if the stories are. So come to the end of, towards the end of Deuteronomy 28, to see further proof that this is a living God who's working with the Jewish people. All right, so firstly, that Deuteronomy 28 gives some very detailed prophecies long before they occur. And we know for sure that these prophecies, because they're independently verified, were written well before the events that they predict actually occurred. And it also sorry, I'm losing my page. And it also gives us the same idea as what we were talking about earlier with Israel coming out of Exodus, painting a picture of a real God who's realistic about the choices that his people will make. All right, so it's the reality of the relationship between the blessings and the relationship with God, and the harsh punishment for the disobedience and the lack of interest in developing a relationship with the one true God. So, as we said, the Jews still exist today, which gives us confidence that the prophecies that God is going to be working with these people, that they're going to be around for a very long time, is in fact true. And the Bible predicts that they're going to have ups and downs, and doesn't just make up a story to say it's going to be smooth sailing. They're going to have triumphs as a nation, and they're going to have obliterating defeats, as we're going to read in Deuteronomy chapter 28. All right, and that's what we know does happen throughout history. Many different places to independently verify that. So let's read the first 7 verses of Deuteronomy chapter 28. This is the good stuff, if you will. And it shall come to pass, if thou shalt hearken diligently unto the voice of Yahweh thy God, to observe and to do all his commandments which I command thee this day, that Yahweh thy God will set thee on high above all the nations of the earth. And these blessings shall come on thee, and overtake thee, if thou shalt hearken unto the voice of Yahweh thy God. Blessed shalt thou be in the city, and blessed shalt thou be in the field. Blessed shalt thou be in the fruit of thy body, and the fruit of thy ground, and the fruit of thy cattle, and of the increase of thy kine, and the flocks of thy sheep. Blessed shall thy basket and thy store. Blessed shalt thou be when thou comest in, and blessed shalt be when thou goest out. Okay, so God is going to work with these people, and he's going to give them amazing promises. There's going to be huge highs in the history of this nation, and the peak period, in my opinion, is the time period of King Solomon, about 3,000 years ago, when Israel had a king, had a good king. And while they were in this land, this promised land that God had given them, they were following their God. They had a relationship with him, and he blessed them. They had blessings in the city, as we read, and blessings in the field, the fruit of their bodies, the abundant population growth. They had thousands, hundreds of thousands in an army, which wasn't actually needed, as it turns out. The cattle, the sheep, the crops, the storehouses, their pantries, they're all absolutely overflowing. And in fact, there's so much wealth that says there was just gold everywhere, to the point where people didn't even bother counting the silver. It was just a bit worthless. It's like your spare change that you put in the donation boxes because you can't be bothered keeping it in your pockets. Okay, so Israel was a centre worldwide for agriculture and for trade. And it's also a centre for worship. Worship of the one true God with this amazing, beautiful, world-renowned temple. A symbol of the importance that Solomon and the people placed on their God as they donated their wealth to be lavished on this temple. Okay, and in verse 7, Yahweh shall cause thine enemies that shall rise up against thee to be smitten before thy face. They shall come out against thee one way and flee before thee 7 ways. Right? Not just talking about Solomon, of course, this is talking about the blessings that they would receive throughout their history if they were working with God. Verse 10, and all the people of the earth shall see that thou art called by the name of Yahweh, and they shall be afraid of thee. And so the reason that these people would have peace and why they had peace in Solomon's time was not because of their own might or strength or clever armies. It was because the people are afraid of the God of the people of Israel, because they're called by that God's name. Right? They're known as the people of God. And therefore to fight Israel, well, that would be to fight the true and living God himself, a scary proposition, especially if you were sort of vaguely superstitious or did actually believe that God was real. So this was the prophecy, and the prophecy came true. One example is the time of Solomon. When the people were focused on God, he protected them and he blessed them. However, there's a very real flip side, and we read of that in verse 15. But it shall come to pass, if thou wilt not hearken unto the voice of Yahweh thy God, to observe to do all his commandments and his statutes which I command thee this day, that all these curses shall come upon thee, and overtake thee. Cursed shall thou be in the city, and cursed shall thou be in the field. Cursed shall thy basket and thy store. Cursed shall the fruit of thy body, and the fruit of thy land, and the increase of thy kine, and the flocks of thy sheep. Cursed shall thou be when thou comest in, and cursed shall thou be when thou goest out. Yahweh shall send upon thee cursing, vexation, and rebuke in all that thou settest thine hand to do, for to do thou shalt be destroyed. And until thou perish quickly, because of the wickedness of thy doings, whereby thou hast forsaken me. So if they didn't obey God's commandments, God says, well, he's going to make life very difficult, very tough. There'd be droughts, there'd be famine, there'd be pestilence, there'd be hail, there'd be disease, and finally there'd be death, and death forever, for the wickedness and forsaking God and not building a relationship with God. And when we read the Bible, when we read through the Jewish history, we see there's countless examples of this happening. All right, and as we said, if this was a book to promote the Jewish cause and that Jews had just made up, well then it would be a book to promote human agenda, but the book includes so many failings, possibly even more than the good stories of when they just aren't living up to God's high calling of being this chosen special nation. Right, so the Bible's filled with real stories and real consequences because there's a very real God behind it. So, and it wasn't just difficulties that they'd face in the land of Israel. There's a promise that certain generations would be taken away from the land altogether. They'd lose the privilege of living in that special land. But we know, of course, from the original promise that God gave to Abraham that the Jews would always come back because it was given them for an everlasting possession. And of course, history, we believe, is guided by the hand of God. So verse 36, we read about that. And Yahweh shall bring over thee, and thy king which thou hast set up over thee, unto a... Sorry, I'll start again. Yahweh shall bring thee and thy king which thou shalt set over thee, unto a nation which thou neither thou nor thy fathers have known. And there shalt thou serve other gods, wood and stone. And thou shalt become an astonishment, a proverb, a byword among all nations, whither Yahweh shall lead thee. Thou shalt carry much seed out into the field, and shalt gather little in, but for the locust shall consume it. Okay, so we read that nations are going to come against these people, right? And nations that have come from a long way away, not nations they've known before in their travels to get to that point. And we know that this happened 3 times in history. It happened with the Assyrians about 700 years before Jesus. It happened with the Babylonians 600 years before Jesus, who captured the southern part of Israel. The Assyrians captured the northern part. And then finally in 70 AD, after Christ, the Romans who captured the whole land of Israel and flooded the slave markets with Jewish slaves. So let's read more detail in verse 49. And remember, this book's written 1,400 years before Jesus, so before any of those 3 invasions of these foreign powers which are coming to take control. And Yahweh shall bring a nation against thee from afar, from the end of the earth, as swift as the eagle flieth, a nation whose tongue you shall not understand. A nation of fierce countenance, which shall not regard the person of the old, nor show favour to the young. And he shall eat the fruit of thy cattle and the fruit of thy land, until thou be destroyed, which also shall not leave thee either corn, wine, or oil, or the increase of thy kine, or flocks of thy sheep, until he hath destroyed thee. And he shall besiege thee in all thy gates, until thy high and fenced walls come down, wherein thou trusted throughout all thy land. And he shall besiege thee in all thy gates throughout all thy land, which Yahweh thy God hath given thee. And thou shalt eat the fruit of thine own body, the flesh of thy sons and of thy daughters, which Yahweh thy God hath given thee, in the siege and in the straitness wherein thine enemies shall distress thee. So that the man that is tender among you and is very delicate, his eye shall be evil towards his brother, and toward the wife of his bosom, and toward the remnant of his children which he shall leave. So that he will not give to any of them the flesh of his children whom he shall eat, because he hath nothing left in him in the siege, and that in the straitness wherewith thine enemies shall distress thee in all thy gates. The tender and delicate woman among you, which would not adventure to set the sole of her foot upon the ground for delicateness and tenderness, her eye shall be evil towards the husband of her bosom, and towards her son, and towards her daughter, and toward her young one that cometh out from between her feet, and toward her children which she shall bear. For she shall eat them for want of all things secretly in the siege and straitness wherein thine enemies shall distress thee in thy gates. If thou wilt not observe to do all the words of this law that are written in this book, that thou mayest fear the glorious and fearful name Yahweh thy God. Okay, so verse 49, it says, and it's terrible section of Scripture, of course. It says, a nation shall be brought from the end of the earth. A nation of fierce countenance. So this could apply to all 3, really. Assyria, Babylon, and to Rome. They're all a long way away. They all spoke different languages, and they're all fierce and mighty warriors because they conquered great empires. Right, but most especially we would see that it does apply to the Romans, who were the furthest away. And it mentions that they'll be as swift as the eagle flieth. Now that could refer to the amazing road system that the Romans built all over their empire, so you could get from one side of Europe to the other very quickly and safely and easily, with their roads all leading back to Rome. But it also will refer to the symbol that they took, the symbol of Rome that was on their standards that they marched into battle, and that was this eagle being a symbol of the Roman people. And we know that that prophecy was fulfilled in AD 70. So this awful description of men and women eating their own children, becoming cannibals out of sheer desperation, and the description of the terror and helplessness that these people are feeling. Well, this did happen. Right? It happened, and it's recorded outside the Bible as well. It happened both when Babylon came against Israel to destroy them. All right? So this is their last hope. Let's say it's Jerusalem, because it did happen to other cities. Their absolute last hope, they believe they're all going to be completely destroyed. So they just keep hoping. They hope that something will happen and someone will come and rescue them, the Egyptians or whoever. And they stay for month after month, year after year, until there's nothing left and they're forced to do terrible, terrible things. And it happened. It's recorded in other history. So this is the consequence, we read, for rejecting God, for rejecting the relationship with God in verse 8, not following and doing the things that God has asked them to do. And still on the consequences of rejecting a relationship with God, verse 63, it's not finished. And it shall come to pass that as Yahweh rejoiced over you to do you good and to multiply you, so Yahweh will rejoice over you to destroy you and to bring you to naught. And ye shall be plucked from the land whither thou goest to possess it. And Yahweh shall scatter thee among all people, from one end of the earth even to the other. And there thou shalt serve other gods, which neither thou nor thy fathers have known, even wood and stone. And among these nations thou shalt find no ease, neither shall the sole of thy foot have rest. But Yahweh shall give thee there a trembling heart, and failing eyes, and sorrow of mind. And thy life shall hang in doubt before thee, and thou shalt fear day and night, and thou shalt have none assurance of thy life. And in the morning thou wouldst say, Would God it were even. And at even thou shalt say, Would God it were morning, for the fear of thine heart wherewith thou shalt fear, for the sight of thine eyes which thou shalt see. And Yahweh shall bring thee into Egypt again with ships, by the way whereof I spoke unto thee. Thou shalt not see it no more again. And they shall be sold unto your enemies for bondmen and bondwomen, and no man shall buy you. So it wasn't just that they'd be destroyed and all completely wiped out. They would be preserved. The Bible predicts the people of Israel were not going to be destroyed, but their nation would. They'd be taken away, plucked away from being a nation as punishment. But they would survive. And they would be sold, we're very clearly told, as slaves. And it wasn't going to be a good time, was it? In verse 66, it's very descriptive. Your life will hang in doubt before you. You'll be in fear day and night. You'll have no assurance of your life. In the morning, I wish it was evening. In the evening, I wish it was morning. They were never happy, never comfortable, never settled. And this is the experience of the Jewish people right throughout history. Verse 37, thou shalt become, chapter 28, going back to the verse we read, and it shall become an astonishment, a proverb and a byword among all nations, whither Yahweh shall lead thee. And that's the experience. That's the history that we can read of these Jewish people. Once they were sold as slaves and they flooded the slave market, And it even says at the end of chapter 28 that no one even wanted to buy them. And I think that's probably a reference to the supply and demand problem. Right? There's too many slaves, and people have enough, and they don't want to spend any more money at all, and they just sit there in the slave market. And being sold into slavery in a Roman world, well, that was a very efficient way to move people around. They came in ships to Egypt. They would have headed up north through Syria and other Roman provinces, where they were literally scattered throughout the Roman world, exactly as God had promised, nearly 1,500 years before it happened. So their life throughout the Roman Empire, and as the Roman Empire morphed into different phases, and we move into the Middle Ages, what was life like for the Jews? Well, we know Nero didn't look after them too well, and that was just the start of how people would begin to treat these Jewish people. The Crusades. We know the Crusades because they tried to come back and conquer Jerusalem, but some Crusades were not taking over the Holy Land. They were actually going and attacking Jewish settlements, where you had thriving Jewish communities throughout France and Germany, and hundreds of Jewish people died in those Crusades. The Black Death came in the 14th century, and the Jews, as everyone needs a good scapegoat, were blamed for causing the Black Death. And thousands, right through Europe, of Jews were killed through these terrible times. Moving to later history, in the 19th century, the pogroms in Russia and the area around Russia, it caused the Jews to live in fear. Pogrom literally means, I think it's a Russian word, to destroy, to wreak havoc, to demolish violently. And one fact I looked up, in Ukraine alone, 250,000 people were killed over quite a long period of time, and up to 500,000 were left homeless. Okay, so these Jews became a proverb and a byword, just like God said they would. But they wouldn't be destroyed completely, of course, but their life would not be easy. And of course, finally and most terribly of all, we come to the Holocaust, in which the Nazi German regime killed 6 million Jewish men, women and children. In modern history, in some of the peoples that we know in their lifetimes. Right? And doesn't it match exactly what verse 65 and 66 tell us? Right? Among these nations that you've been dispersed in, you will have no ease. Neither shall the sole of thy foot have rest. But Yahweh shall give thee a trembling heart and a failing of eyes and sorrow of mind. Right? It's a terrible thing to read, but it's a real thing. And it's a thing that God had predicted before, and he'd given them options, a way not to go through these experiences. And of course, for the people who went through AD 70, they had rejected God as he appeared to them in the personality of our Lord Jesus Christ, right, who was going to show them who God was and how to build a relationship with God. And they said, we don't want anything to do with it. Let's kill this man because he's an inconvenience, right, because we're jealous of him. So the Jews brought their blood upon their own heads, and these experiences that we read of are as a result of that. But as we know from the promises to Abraham, Israel, the people of Israel, would never be completely destroyed. They couldn't be, because if they did, then God was not speaking the truth. In fact, God may not exist if all the Jews were wiped out, and we could not say today that there were Jews to prove that the stories had all been true. All right, and the Jews needed to fulfill other Bible prophecies to come back to the land of Israel. But they wouldn't be able to if there was, in this previously called land of Israel, land of Palestine, as as it was before the foundation of the state of Israel, an unfriendly nation who was living there, or a strong nation who was living there. But in God's planning and God's purpose, he makes sure it's a friendly nation, the British nation, who really had no particular business being there. And they decide that they're happy to give it up, to give it over, to create the state of Israel again. A huge hiatus, nearly 1900 years, where there was no Jewish nation, where they had been punished according to the prophecies in Deuteronomy chapter 28, but they are brought back according to what we'd expect, with the same prophecies given throughout the pages of the Bible. So we'll come now to our reading, and this is our last quote in Isaiah chapter 43. And we'll read verse 1 for the context. But now thus saith Yahweh that created thee, O Jacob, and he that formed thee, O Israel, fear not, for I have redeemed thee. I have called thee by thy name, thou art mine. So it's God talking to the people of Israel. And he says in verse 10, people of Israel, you are my witnesses, says Yahweh, and my servant whom I have chosen, that ye may know me and believe me and understand that I am he. Before me there was no God formed, neither shall be after me. I, even I, am Yahweh, and beside me there is no Saviour. I have declared and have saved, and have showed when there was no strange God among you. Therefore ye are my witnesses, saith Yahweh, that I am God. So we are the observers, ladies and gentlemen. We are observing these things, and we're watching God's witnesses. We're watching the things that God has predicted come true time and time again. Things that you couldn't make up. Blessings and cursings, both on the people and on other people who were interacting with them. Nazi Germany, for example, those who severely cursed the people of Israel. Well, they themselves were cursed and lost the war. But Israel are his witnesses, and we are the observers, and we observe and we say, with all the evidence that we have of these people and the experiences that they go for, we say that God is God. Beside him, there is no Saviour. Thank you.